Imagine waking up in one of the world's first farming villages and discovering that a small wild predator has moved into your food storage. It does not obey you. It does not guard your home. It does not carry anything, pull anything, or warn you when strangers arrive. It refuses to explain why it is there. But every morning, there are fewer mice. So you make one of the most important decisions in the history of pets. You do absolutely nothing. You do not chase the animal away. You do not trap it. You do not train it. You simply allow it to remain near the village. And somehow, thousands of years later, its descendants are sleeping on human beds, screaming at closed doors, and behaving as though the entire domestication process was our privilege rather than theirs. Dogs were shaped by humans. Sheep were managed by humans. Cattle were controlled by humans. But cats may have entered human society through a completely different doorway. We did not drag them out of the wild. We accidentally built a place they wanted to live. And once they arrived, they never truly surrendered their independence. So how did a solitary wildcat from the Near East become one of the most successful companion animals on Earth? Why did this relationship begin only after humans settled down? And did ancient humans domesticate cats, or did cats domesticate themselves? To understand that, we have to begin before the first house cat, before the first farming village, and before humans had anything a cat considered worth stealing. For most of our species' existence, humans were mobile. Hunter-gatherer groups moved through large territories, following seasonal plants, migrating animals, water sources, and weather. They built camps, stayed for a while, and moved again. Wildcats already lived across parts of Africa, Europe, and Asia. Humans certainly saw them. A person gathering plants or checking a trap may have caught a flash of striped fur disappearing into grass. At night, yellow eyes may have watched from beyond the firelight. But these encounters did not automatically become relationships. A mobile human camp was not especially useful to a wildcat. There might be scraps for a few days, but then the humans disappeared. There were no permanent buildings, no large grain stores, and no stable population of rodents concentrated in one predictable location. From the cat's perspective, humans were loud, dangerous, and temporary. Then, roughly 12,000 years ago, parts of human life began to change. In the Fertile Crescent, communities increasingly cultivated wild cereals, managed landscapes, stored harvested food, and remained in the same places for longer periods. This transformation is often described as the beginning of agriculture, but agriculture did not simply create more food, it created a new ecosystem. The moment humans began collecting thousands of edible seeds and placing them together inside pits, baskets, clay containers, and storage buildings, they created one of the greatest rodent restaurants in history. Mice did not need an invitation. They could smell food, enter through tiny gaps, reproduce rapidly, and eat supplies that had taken humans months of labor to produce. This was not a small annoyance. For early farmers, stored grain was survival. It carried a community through dry seasons, cold months, failed harvests, and periods when fresh food was scarce. If rodents destroyed enough of it, people could starve. Humans tried barriers, sealed containers, raised floors, traps, and probably a great deal of frustrated shouting. But mice are very good at being mice. Then another animal noticed the situation. The African wildcat, Felis sylvestris libica, is a lean, striped predator that looks surprisingly similar to many modern domestic cats. It has excellent hearing, fast reflexes, sharp claws, patience, and an intense interest in small moving animals. A farming settlement full of rodents was not merely convenient. It was an ecological jackpot. The boldest wildcats began approaching the edges of villages. At first, they were probably not interested in humans at all. They were following prey. A cat that could tolerate smoke, voices, footsteps, and unfamiliar smells gained access to more mice than a cat that fled whenever a human moved. And the humans were also making a calculation. A wildcat near the grain store might be dangerous to a chicken or steal a scrap of meat. But it was also killing the animals that were eating the village's future. So instead of treating every cat as a threat, some humans tolerated them. That tolerance changed everything. This early stage is often described as the commensal pathway to domestication. The cats benefited from living near humans. Humans benefited from reduced rodent pressure. Neither species needed a formal agreement. There was no ancient village meeting where someone announced, "We will now begin a 10,000-year feline breeding program." The relationship emerged because both sides kept receiving enough value to remain near each other. But there was still a problem. Wildcats are not naturally small dogs. They are territorial, cautious, and largely solitary hunters. An adult wildcat does not normally walk into a crowd of primates and ask to be touched. So the first cats living near villages were probably not pets. They were wild animals operating inside a human-created hunting zone. The village was useful, but humans were still risky. This is where natural selection may have begun doing work that humans never planned. Wildcats vary in temperament. Some are extremely fearful. Others are bolder, calmer, or more curious. Near a settlement, the least fearful cats could hunt closer to grain stores, shelters, and rubbish. They had access to a concentrated food supply and possibly safer places to raise kittens. The most fearful cats remained farther away. Generation after generation, cats that could tolerate human activity were more likely to remain within the village ecosystem. Their kittens grew up surrounded by human voices, cooking smells, footsteps, tools, children, and firelight. The cats were not becoming obedient. They were becoming less likely to panic. That difference sounds small, but it is the foundation of domestication. Humans may not have chosen which cats reproduced in the beginning. The environment did. The grain selected the mice selected the cats, and the village selected the cats that could live beside humans without losing their minds. This is why saying that humans simply tamed wild cats is misleading. Taming happens to an individual animal. Domestication happens across populations and generations. One friendly wildcat is still a wildcat. But when calmer animals repeatedly survive and reproduce near people, the population slowly changes. The first true village cats may have domesticated themselves not because they wanted affection, but because fear was becoming expensive. Now consider what these early settlements were like after sunset. During the day, people worked. They harvested plants, prepared food, repaired tools, cared for children, processed hides, carried water, and protected stored resources. At night, the social atmosphere changed. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer communities cannot give us a perfect recording of prehistoric life, but they show an important pattern. Conversations around firelight often shift away from practical daily problems and towards stories, jokes, songs, memories, myths, and social bonding. In other words, the campfire was not just a heater. It was an ancient social network. For a wildcat watching from outside the light, this gathering may have looked chaotic. Humans laughed, moved unpredictably, passed food, and produced sounds no sensible prey animal would make. But the gathering also created opportunity. Firelight attracted insects. Food scraps attracted rodents. Human numbers discouraged some larger predators. Warm structures offered shelter. And because people were focused on one another, a small cat could hunt along the edges without becoming the center of attention. We cannot prove that ancient nightlife domesticated the cat. That would be too neat. But repeated nighttime contact may have helped turn humans from terrifying strangers into predictable background noise. A cat did not need to love the people around the fire. It only needed to learn that these particular humans usually did not attack. Night after night, the distance could shrink. First, the cat hunted beyond the settlement, then beside the storage building, then beneath a platform, then near a doorway, and eventually a kitten was born close enough for a human child to notice. Children may have been one of the bridges between tolerance and companionship. This idea is difficult to prove archaeologically, but behaviorally it makes sense. Young animals are often more adaptable than adults. Kittens exposed to human contact during early development can become far more comfortable around people. And human children are famously willing to approach small animals with a level of confidence that adult judgment would not recommend. A child might offer scraps. A kitten might return. The child might touch it. The kitten might discover that hands can provide warmth and food rather than danger. Not every attempt would have ended well. Ancient children almost certainly collected scratches while contributing to science, but repeated interactions between people and settlement-born kittens could have created cats that did more than tolerate human presence. Some began to seek it. At this point, the relationship was no longer only about pest control. A useful predator was becoming a familiar individual, and archaeology gives us one extraordinary glimpse of that transition. Around 9,500 years ago, at the Neolithic site of Shiluro-Cambos on Cyprus, a cat was buried close to a human. The placement appears deliberate. That alone is striking, but the location makes it even more important. Cyprus is an island, and wildcats were not native there. Humans had transported cats across the sea. Think about what that required. Someone had to capture or manage a cat, place it in a boat, keep it alive during the crossing, and bring it into a new settlement. This animal was not simply following mice into a nearby grain store. Humans deliberately carried it into an environment it could never have reached alone. Why? Perhaps cats were valued as rodent hunters. Perhaps this individual had become a companion. Most likely, usefulness and attachment were already blending together. The burial cannot tell us exactly what the person felt. But people do not usually transport animals across open water and place them carefully beside the dead if those animals mean nothing. By that point, the cat had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer merely wildlife living near humans. It belonged inside the human story. The relationship continued to spread. Later populations of cats associated with the Near East and Egypt moved along human trade routes. They traveled in farming communities, ports, caravans, and ships. Sailors had an obvious reason to tolerate them. A ship carrying grain, rope, cloth, and food was also vulnerable to rodents. A cat on board was a living pest control system that required no batteries and ignored management. As human networks expanded, cats expanded with them. But even after thousands of years, cats changed less dramatically than many other domestic animals. Compare a Chihuahua with a wolf and human selection becomes obvious. Compare a house cat with an African wildcat and the difference can be surprisingly subtle. Their body plans remain similar. Their hunting sequence remains intact. Their territorial behavior, stalking, pouncing, scratching, and prey drive are still recognizably wild. For much of their history, humans selected cats mainly for behavior and usefulness, not for extreme body shapes. The enormous variety of specialized cat breeds is relatively recent. For most ancient people, the ideal cat was simply a cat that stayed nearby, killed rodents, and did not attack the household. This helps explain the strange balance inside modern cats. They can form strong attachments to humans. They recognize routines, voices, gestures, and individuals. They may sleep beside us, follow us through rooms, and become distressed when a familiar person disappears. But they also retain an unusual degree of independence. A cat does not behave like a badly trained dog. It behaves like an animal whose ancestors entered the human world without giving up the basic equipment of a solitary hunter. Even the domestic meow reflects this relationship. Adult wildcats rarely communicate with one another through constant meowing. Domestic cats, however, use vocal signals extensively with humans. Over generations, they appear to have learned a humiliating truth about our species. Humans are easy to manipulate with sound. A cat meows. A person opens a door. The cat meows again. Food appears. From the cat's perspective, this is excellent training progress. And that may be the deepest lesson in the entire story. Cat domestication was not a conquest. It was a negotiation without language. Humans changed the landscape. Farming created stored food. Stored food created rodents. Rodents attracted wildcats. Wildcats protected part of the human food supply. Humans tolerated the cats. Bolder cats remained closer. Their kittens grew up around people. Some humans began treating them as individuals. Then those cats traveled wherever humans carried grain, built settlements, and launched ships. No one designed the complete process. It emerged from thousands of tiny decisions. A farmer decided not to throw a stone. A cat decided not to run. A child offered food. A kitten returned the next night. A family allowed it to sleep near the wall. A traveler placed one in a boat. And slowly, a wild predator entered the human home. So did ancient humans domesticate cats? Yes, but not in the way we domesticated most animals. We did not force them into a job and redesign their bodies around it. We created a problem, accidentally created the perfect solution, and then allowed that solution to move indoors. Cats chose the village because the village had mice. They stayed because tolerant cats did better there, and we kept them because life was easier with them around. The result is an animal that lives inside human society while still behaving as though it negotiated a private contract 10,000 years ago. Food will be provided. Warm places will be available. Doors will be opened on request. In exchange, the cat may kill a mouse. Or it may stare at the mouse, look back at you, and decide that the ancient agreement no longer covers this situation. Either way, the relationship continues. Not because humans completely conquered the wildcat, but because for one small predator at the edge of the first farming villages, human civilization looked like a risk worth taking.